it's totally inexcusable what's gone on at the club for a long time now. And I don't know how they can be so possibly impervious to this level of criticism.
The Glazer family may continue to sit silently in their ivory towers, but the voice of the Manchester United supporter will grow ahead of another unified weekend of protests. We're covering the events at Broadhurst Park and the continued attempts to preserve fan culture ahead of the return to Premier League football on Tuesday, the growing impact of Ruben Amorim in the Northwest, and exclusive information regarding Roger and Hugo Ekitike. All on the latest episode of your Theatre of Red. We are counting down the minutes towards Tuesday's return to Premier League football, with Manchester United making the arduous trip to the City Ground to face high-flying Nottingham Forest. Didn't think I'd be saying that at this time of the season. An 8 o'clock fixture has supporters eager for a return, but attention will first turn to a significant United day at Broadhurst Park on Saturday. Now, alongside me is a man well known across continental football for his work with Sky Sports and the Truth podcast. It's Mr. Dougie Critchley. You are very welcome to the show, sir. How is everything on your end?
Thanks very much, Shaun. Yeah, I'm super well. I too am looking forward to the return of club football. I think it's been an interesting international break, but we've got an intriguing set of FA Cup quarterfinals before we have the return of the Premier League. And yeah, a lot riding on those quarterfinals. Aside from Man City, every side particularly desperate to get their hands on that trophy. So I'm looking forward to that this weekend and then back to the Premier League on Tuesday. So can't wait.
At this stage of the season, this is something I always look at. Obviously, I'm devastated that our involvement in the competition is no longer. But when you look at the teams that are there and you look at teams in around qualifying for European spots, and progression often leads to fixture congestion. And it can provide such an arduous task for the managers who at most squads are absolutely riddled with injuries at this point of the season, particularly after the internationals. So it's going to make for a very interesting weekend of football leading into Tuesday. But as I said a moment ago, and it is important given the magnitude of the events that are going to occur at Broadhurst Park on Saturday afternoon. They're going to happen before and during FC United's fixture against Stockton Town. Just for those unaware, if there is any, a joint protest, which is the first of its kind between FC United and the 1958, will take place against the Glazer ownership, idle mismanagement and the current state of affairs at Manchester United Football Club. Dougie, like the scenes before the Arsenal fixture in Manchester at the beginning of March, supporters are unifying in an attempt to reclaim and salvage fan culture, affordable football, and essentially responsible ownership in the game. Now, FC United came to fruition over 20 years ago in response to the American arrival in the Northwest. And amongst the many scenes of protest that consumed Manchester in around 2005, the message remains as strong today as it was then. You being an advocate for the growth and the support of football across the continent, I saw that you recently took to your social account to explain your understanding of what is happening at Manchester United under Ineos, and inevitably came under the expected scrutiny that will follow anything resembling support of a tone-deaf hierarchy. Yes, I know there is an inevitability for cuts and cost-saving measures across the board when any new structure advances in its ideals at a new football club or a business. As I've said numerous times on this show, billionaires don't become billionaires by squandering their money and making what is deemed to be a crowd-pleasing decision like Jim simply clearing the American debt. That said, when you have Radcliffe appearing somewhat flabbergasted at Gary Neville's suggestion of player functions to pay for the older representatives of the club rather than simply cutting the funding, I think it leaves more than a handful of questions for those watching. So, given the measures that the 1958 FC United must and every other supporter group and organisation on the planet have taken to preserve the importance of fan culture in 2025, as a neutral here, what is your view of the state of play at Old Trafford and the nature of the protest to come at Broadhurst Park on Saturday?
Well, it's a good question. And first of all, I want to point out that I've got immense pity and I feel very sorry for what's gone on at Man United over the last 20 years in terms of the way the club's been run and the misuse of funds that should have been better directed into the playing squad effectively and the facilities and just the general upkeep of Man United as a club, because it's definitely, you have spent considerable sums on transfers, etc., but not really in proportion to the amount of turnover you've made in that period. And that is a huge part down to the mismanagement by the Glazers. I tweeted out in, I think it was early March, late February, and I didn't really, I mean, it's always difficult on Twitter or on any social media to get your point across fully. And perhaps it was slightly misworded, but I didn't want to come across that I was defending billionaires effectively. I don't think billionaires should exist. I don't think that's not a particularly out there take, as it were. And my point was, though, given the fact they do exist, I agree with you in that billionaires become billionaires by making ruthless, selfish decisions. And I tweeted this before Sir Jim Ratcliffe then did that interview with Gary Neville, which I did think opened a lot of fans' eyes to the true extent of the financial issues at Old Trafford, particularly when he said Man United would have gone out of business at the end of this year without cuts. So it was clear that they needed to change things after years of Glazer, Woodward, whoever in charge management, and just an absence of management in some cases, an absence of communication from the Glazers. But I was trying to get my head around why he would be making so many redundancies to sort of staff that really wouldn't be paid anywhere close to the amount that footballers are paid. And I think it's very easy for journalists, often at tabloid newspapers, to write headlines, 20 staff laid off at Old Trafford, Christmas lunch cancelled, staff paying for their own lunch, etc., whilst Luke Shaw is on £250,000 per week and has started 8 games, for example, or whatever. It's very easy to write that, but obviously it is much easier to make redundant staff that are on £50,000 per year than offload stars on £250,000 per year whose transfer fees still need to be amortised, who have been underperforming for years. And that's just logic. As brutal as it is, that is just logic. But it doesn't make it any less painful to Man United fans and people that care about the club to watch the ambassadors be stripped of or the veterans be stripped of their backing, etc. And that was the most troubling part of the Sir Jim Ratcliffe interview for me, was that Gary Neville came up with, by his own admission, a fairly basic idea for how to raise money and keep the veteran support going. And Sir Jim Ratcliffe seemed almost sort of affronted or surprised by the suggestion of that. And if people inside Old Trafford they make you believe that they have hired best in class, aren't coming up with these ideas, then what are they doing? And there's also an element which I do really get behind, which Man United fans replied to my tweet in, saying, they chose to keep Ten Hag. They waited for Dan Ashworth for months and months and then fired him very soon after. And Sir John Ratcliffe did accept responsibility for those decisions in that interview, but it's a bitter pill to swallow when they're also watching club staff laid off, and the kind of the sort of fabric of Man United felt like it's being sort of pulled apart. So there has been a lot of negativity, a lot of it deserved. And perhaps on reflection, I should have worded my tweet a little bit better, because, the last thing I want to do is come out with too much sympathy for billionaires.
Well, you see, this is the primary reason I wanted to engage in a conversation with you today, because I've been following what you've been doing for quite some time due to our shared love of the continental game. I know how difficult it is to get across a very complex, not necessarily debate or argument, but a point of view on a social platform where you have very limited time or characters to be able to do so. Regardless of the nature of the information that you and I deliver on a daily basis, there's always going to be pushback. There's always going to be criticism and negativity. Personally, this is something that I've been involved in for as long as I can remember. And the disdain that I have for idle ownership, it goes beyond words. I know as a journalist, we're supposed to remain impartial, but my love for this football club goes back to the 80s. As many listeners know, I've been there since Pete Molyneux held that banner up saying, "Tara Fergie," back in 1989. I was very small then, admittedly, but I was there before it all sort of came to fruition. What we see now, and it really culminates with what's going to occur at Broadhurst Park, is a union of the existing Manchester United supporters group in the 58 who are trying to channel a sense of fan culture and to remain positive within a situation that seems as dire as it's ever been for the working class individuals of this football club. So much of this comes to the fore, obviously, with the idle mismanagement of what we see with the Glazers. And I wanted to get your interpretation on something, because I'm finding it very hard to wrap my head around a certain circumstance regarding Jim Ratcliffe, Ineos, and the ownership of Manchester United. As we can now all see, the SEC filings represent a certain level of determination from the billionaire to potentially move towards a majority ownership in the future. Although I'm no financial whiz, I have sort of unraveled what I have seen to look towards the possibility that maybe they could target some of the less interested siblings en route to that majority ownership in the future. They've inevitably become the fall guy, because the Glazers continue to sit back in America in their ivory towers, just laughing at what's occurring. Jim Ratcliffe has become the individual who's going to take the blunt for everything. Now, in saying that, I'm not backing him. I'm not supporting him. I'm not trying to offer any sort of reasoning as to why I support cuts when there is such a naivety to something, as we both referenced with Gary Neville suggesting the most simple of solution to one of the issues, and it just seems to go by a totally tone-deaf audience. But from everything that you've seen, and obviously with your history and your work that you do with Sky Sports and the individuals that you converse with on a daily basis, coupling the fact that Jim Ratcliffe has come out and basically discussed the level of scrutiny, criticism and abuse that he's receiving, that if it was to go to a certain level, that he doesn't see the worth in doing what he's trying to do. Do you believe that there is a genuine aspiration there in 2025 for him pursuing his ownership in the club and taking over majority ownership in the future still?
I'd have thought so. I mean, everything in that interview pointed towards the fact that he's pretty determined. And Gary Neville pointed out that given his age, he doesn't really need to be doing what he's doing, but he's doing it out of a self-confessed love for the club. I think what has been most damaging is, I think, and we'll get onto this with Ruben Amorim as well, I think people had this belief that everything would be sorted very quickly, at least what I saw online. I think people are very positive. There's a lot of naivety, as we've already talked about, and probably weren't fully aware of the scale of financial issues at the club, the mismanagement of at technical director level for years, the priority of finances over playing squad, the number of poor decisions in that playing squad for a large amount of time. And he has hired best-in-class people to make these decisions. I mean, Sir Dave Brailsford, to be fair to anyone criticising him, has a pretty mixed record in recent years. But Omar Barada is a very, very highly thought of executive, etc. And there's a number of other people that he's hired. I mean, Dan Ashworth was supposed to be the guy as well that was supposed to take Man United forward, set up the right culture, bring in the right people, stop making immediate short-term decisions. And I think Man United have, in the last 6 months, started to look to the longer term. And I think the fact that the stadium is clearly a key part of his project moving forward, which is going to take at least, I think, are they saying 5 years to build? That suggests that he is in it for the long term. As for the Glazers, I think it's totally inexcusable what's gone on at the club for a long time now. And I don't know how they can be so possibly impervious to this level of criticism, like this level of hate. I obviously they're making money out of the club, but surely your morality kicks in at some stage and you think we've drained enough from this club, we should leave it alone. But yeah, year after year, it continues. And you've got Sir Jim Ratcliffe having to not defend them per se, but definitely not criticise them in a public sphere. And for so long, I think Sir Alex Ferguson probably, it was an impossible situation given that they were his bosses and a number of players. I mean, you've seen Gary Neville become a lot more vocal in the last few years as probably the key ex-player in terms of media influence. But maybe it was a little too late. And hopefully it does change for the better, because I do believe that Jim Ratcliffe is in it for the best reasons. Ultimately, though, at the moment, he and the decision-making that they're having to go through is causing a lot of pain to fans like yourself.
Fans like myself and individuals that have been there far longer in the tooth than I have, as well as newer generations that have evolved through the years. And we're going to see a culmination of that, as I've made reference to on several occasions, with FC United's fixture. For anyone interested in getting involved with Saturday's proceedings, you can get yourself to Broadhurst Park at 1 p.m. on Saturday and play your part in protest to join those who continue to stand firm in opposition to the Glazers, to try to persevere with maintaining a sense of fan culture. And the socialist in me always comes out when I speak about this, Dougie. And it irks me to my core that these individuals can get away with such hideous crimes. The fan base will continue to fight back against it, will continue to rear their voice. And as I've said, you can play your part at Broadhurst Park at 1 p.m. on Saturday. Now, Dougie, given our shared love for the game, as I've said, and our continued perseverance towards consuming as much continental football as is humanly possible, I feel there is much to discuss. Before Ruben Amorim arrived in Manchester, the majority of world football had heard about his sporting revolution and essentially what was the magic wand that he was waving in Lisbon. I recall a segment that you provided on Sky, which dissected his traits, his desires, and his ability to craft, we'll say, a high-stake possession-branded game within the unique foundations of his 3-4-3 structure. Now, at the time, you felt that it would be an interesting appointment and zoomed into the intricate details from front to back. I've recently published a piece which highlights the importance of his back-to-front philosophy, the significance of his defenders and their line through the build-up phases, given how integral this was to the success of his time in Portugal, which was truly epitomised in his European swansong against Pep's Manchester City in the Champions League. His transition to English football has left many would-be experts questioning his judgment in insisting to utilise his principles while enduring much adversity. However, we are now beginning to see signs of green shoots. Before we probe individual conversations and form, how have you viewed his transition into the English game from Sporting?
I think if you go back to the very beginning, this is a guy that from his third game in charge of his first managerial job at Casapir, was playing 3-4-3. So I think quite early doors, maybe 2 months into his Man United time, when things hadn't really clicked so far, there were so many people saying he needs to change system, he needs to change the setup, it's clearly not working. And I always thought that was incredibly naive, because this is a guy that, from that third game in charge, has had remarkable success with this system and has been bullish and stubborn in his desire to see it work. And his managerial career up until Sporting CP has been absolutely phenomenal. It's been real smooth riding. So he had to leave Casapir fairly soon after because he didn't have the right coaching qualifications. He then goes to Braga. He won 10 of his first 13 games in charge. That included a win in the Taça Liga, the equivalent of the League Cup there. They got their first win away at Benfica in 65 years. In March 2020, so just 4 months later, Sporting paid his €10 million buyout. And Sporting had been, up until that time, a little bit of a mess. There had been an invasion, almost, for want of a better word, of diehards at the training ground. They'd attacked players. It had been a complete mess. They'd been managed horrendously by their president, who then got accused of all sorts of crimes against the club, etc. And players like Rafa Leão, like Rafinha, like Bruno Fernandes had all left. And in his first sort of 3 months or so, he eventually leads the club to fourth. And the next season, he goes 32 games unbeaten. He wins their first title in 19 years. So that, on the paper, on the surface, must excite United fans. Came into an arguably more violent mess than Man United right now, although less pressure on the job and less scrutiny, and Sporting CP don't have the same level of expectations in the Portuguese league as Man United do in the Premier League, even though it feels like a long time ago now. And he instantly, by promoting youngsters like Gonçalo Inácio, he brought João Palhinha back from Braga, he instantly got this side really clicking. And it didn't happen so quickly at Man United. It hasn't happened. But this is a guy who consistently lost his best players when at Sporting CP, whether that's Manuel Ugarte going to PSG, Nuno Mendes going to PSG. They lost Matheus Nunes, who was pretty crucial at Sporting CP when Sporting played Man City years ago under Amorim. This was Matheus Nunes in that kind of Pep way, saying he was one of the best players in the world, which obviously wasn't accurate as well. But he lost Matheus Nunes, he lost Pedro Porro. And in his final 11 games this season, he won all 11. They scored 39 goals. As you say, they blitzed some teams in the Champions League, most notably Pep Guardiola's Man City, conceding just 5 in the league. They beat Lille, who beat Atletico Madrid and Real Madrid. They drew with PSV, which at the time seemed like quite a good result because PSV were doing very well in the Eredivisie. But since taking over at Man United, I think it's worth just emphasising again that this is a squad that has been built with far too much control from the previous manager in Erik ten Hag. And there is a number of players that have really struggled to live up to their reputations, like Casemiro. There are players that were overpaid for at the time, like Rasmus Højlund, and players like Onana, who haven't lived up to expectations. There's been injuries to key signings like Mason Mount, Lisandro Martinez. There have been personal issues with a number of stars like Jadon Sancho, like Marcus Rashford, like Antony. And you're arriving at a club in November time, which has been wedded to, well, I mean, the philosophy was almost non-existent, but a 4-2-3-1 or iterations of it. And you're trying to instill a 3-4-3 mid-season into a squad which is bereft of confidence and really has a number of injuries in it as well. So it all has to be taken into by that context. But if I'm totally honest, I did think it would take, and it has improved in the last few weeks, which we should talk about, but I did think there'd be a better upturn and a more immediate upturn in results.
I wonder how much of that is put down to the caliber of player that he has available to him. I don't know, is it down to talent? Because as I've said in recent weeks, even though there is so much emphasis put on the lack of ability within this squad and the poor purchases that have been brought through, I still think you have to have a little something about you if you do end up at Manchester United. I do believe that the consensus throughout the supporter base was a necessity for time, understanding and patience, given the complete shift in tactical ideals inherited by the Ineos backroom team, as you've touched upon. When you assemble a squad for a 4-2-3-1 and then mid-season turn to a 3-at-the-back philosophy, there's always going to be stumbling blocks and disappointments. As Amorim himself highlighted following that comprehensive hiding of Everton in December, you're getting at the stage when supporters might start getting a little bit ahead of themselves with what they're after seeing when United are putting 4 goals past the Premier League opponent. But the first thing he came out and said was things are going to get rough. We're going to get found out and people need to realise that this is going to happen. However, as bad as things have gone in recent months, particularly during that horrific Christmas period, I do believe the side have entered 2025 in stronger fashion. You've got impressive displays against Liverpool, twice against Arsenal. That's not even taking into consideration the domination that was shown against what is truthfully a poor Real Sociedad side that have been obliterated with transfers themselves and injuries. But that is en route to maintaining an unbeaten run on passage to a Europa League quarter-final meeting with Lyon. And despite the danger that Lyon will possess, Manchester United will once again be favourites for that tie, despite dealing with a plethora of injuries and setbacks, as you've alluded to. Are you seeing an emergence of the Portuguese confidence in this system after 4 short months?
I think so. I think initially, and you've got to take into account the amount of injuries, as you say, and the fixture list as well in particular. Like, he didn't actually have that many training sessions for a long time. And it looked like it at points. The gaps between defenders, the gap between midfield and defence, far too open, not really seeing the sort of automatic attacking sequences or any real threat. And you've got to take into account that Ahmed looked like his guy early doors that was going to be that spark. He then gets injured, and he has managed to elicit one of Bruno's most special periods as a player out of Man United's best player. And this at a time where Højlund has been, up until recently, really, really bereft of confidence. And you've got Joshua Zirkzee, who's arrived for a middling fee, Serie A Young Player of the Year, and maybe slightly misprofiled as a number 9. I think he has amazing ability to hold on to the ball, bring others into play, but he's not a last shoulder runner. He doesn't make particularly dynamic runs in the box. He maybe doesn't have the express pace that you'd hope for in the Premier League. But I'm not writing him off as a player. I do think he's an immensely talented footballer. But actually, as you point out, in the last month or so, it's really, really improved. Man United, and this feels like a small achievement given where they've been in the last few years, but they're 4 games unbeaten now. They're unbeaten in 4 league games for the second time this season, but they're still yet to win consecutive league games all campaign, which is absolutely nuts. And since Amorim took over, they still sit 14th. Your goal difference is -3, 22 points from 18 games. That would be 46 points across an entire season. It hasn't been good enough. But I think in the last month or so, you've seen a maybe realization that a deep block is going to be more effective right now. And you've seen improved performances out of players that looked previously quite done at Man United. I think even Casemiro, who has really struggled after his first campaign, has benefited from the bringing in of the gaps between midfield and defence and the closer relationship with his fellow central midfielder. As you say, Dorgu's had a great last month or so. I think De Ligt's looked a lot better. Heaven, prior to injury, looked like a real bargain. And there has been, this amazing run of form from Bruno Fernandes. And you've still got Mainu to come back into this side. You've got Mason Mount, who looks like he should be a real strong fit for this system as well. So there are definitely green shoots. It's just, I think it's clear that Man United's issues are deeper than players. And also you look at the way that players that have left Man United have gone on to perform almost immediately in Rashford, in Antony, in Wan-Bissaka, in McTominay, who've all had great impact for their new clubs, whether on loan or permanently there. And I do think the talk online that Man United just don't have any quality players, I just don't think that's accurate. Like, Lenny Yoro was one of the most talented young players in the entirety of Europe last year in terms of defenders. Matthijs de Ligt has, persuaded 2 clubs to spend over 70 million euros on him. Mazraoui was a regular for an Ajax side when fit that excelled in that under Ten Hag and then gets a move to Bayern Munich. Xerxes, Serie A Young Player of the Year. I don't think you've signed bad players, but it's clear that the scrutiny and the pressure and the sort of negative headlines generated by Man United for off-pitch decisions seem to weigh heavily on players. And when your performances are quite literally costing the livelihood of staff that have been there, as you point out, for a generation, that's going to weigh heavily on you. So Man United need to sort out the culture off the pitch to almost alleviate some pressure on it. And I think expectations for next season are going to be really, really interesting, because I would have thought on the back of this year, challenging for a Europa League spot would probably be a really good achievement for Man United. You look at where City are going to be with Rodri back. You look at the investment that Arsenal are going to put into key positions. Liverpool too. They feel completely untouchable. But can Man United get amongst the Chelsea, Villa, Newcastle, sort of chasing pack? Forest might drop off a little bit and be in that chasing pack next year. Maybe, but there's a long, long way to go.
I think so much of it buys into confidence. And as you've referenced with the players leaving, it's almost like the shackles and the expectation of playing in that cauldron at the Theatre of Dreams. It weighs heavy on so many players. That is something that I want to tie into, because you've referenced a player that I do want to speak to you about. It ties back into our initial talking point about the mismanagement of vital owners. The financial hardship is playing its part in what is going to be a pivotal summer window in Manchester, particularly with everything that you've discussed. As everybody knows, outgoings will inevitably play a crucial role in supplementing a summer transfer kitty. But the importance of utilising a shrewd scouting network is also going to be key. Speaking to those on the ground in the past couple of days, I've been advised that it is no longer a case of trying to attract the biggest names in world football, and that there is now an agreed stance of looking past what is deemed as a dated ideology. Those are the exact words that I was given. This ties in with our report of the club's interest in Braga youngster Roger Fernandez, who's a player of massive interest to Amorim and the club. The fact that the focus is now being placed on youth. Guys that can come in and do a job that might be a bit raw, but have the potential to move forward. And you've referenced the attacking issues. And the number 9 position continues to generate much conversation in the game, with Højlund often lamented for his inability to lead the line. Truthfully, you strip this back and you see the glaring issues in the recruitment department to not add a senior striker at the same time to help this young lad acclimatise to the game and the nature of the beast at Old Trafford. It's undeniable. He's been dealt a very bum hand with that. Interestingly, I have this morning received clarification from an individual close to Carrington that I trust very much, and they advise of an increased interest in Eintracht Frankfurt frontman Hugo Ekitike. He's 22 years of age, 6'3". He's got 19 goals and 8 assists in 38 appearances throughout the season. He's another young, talented, tenacious player, and he can play as the sole frontman in his system. As I confirmed this morning, around Manchester United continues to be this unified focus on recruitment of young players. I'm also advised that the club are not presently looking at offloading Højlund because of a mixture of a number of factors, from his age, his potential, the ability that he has when he is not completely shroud of confidence, as you've said, and the fact that it would be difficult to recoup the fee that they've paid for him. Although Ekitike is the same age, he would bring more experience at the highest level playing in the Bundesliga than Højlund did. How do you feel about Hugo as a player?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think you look at Ekitike's career so far, and he's got more experience than Højlund at big clubs. So in 2022, he'd had a real breakout year at Reims in Ligue 1, and he was strongly linked with Newcastle at that time in that early part of that summer. That eventually fell through because he chose to go to PSG. That was an amazing opportunity. This was still the PSG with Neymar and Mbappe and all these star forwards. And that move didn't necessarily work out for him. He struggled for minutes, etc. Goes on loan to Eintracht Frankfurt, then signs permanently last summer and hasn't really taken a backward step since. I think he's been really, really impressive for an Eintracht Frankfurt side that, similarly to Man United, often play a system with 3 at the back that are looking to dominate teams, not necessarily through complete possession at the moment. They're very much a counter-attacking side. His numbers haven't really dropped off significantly since his buddy, his strike partner, Omar Marmoush, left for Man City in January. And where Højlund came to Man United really with only 6 months kind of starting as a starter at Atalanta, an Atalanta side under Gasperini that has continually juiced the numbers of their attacking players. You know, Charles de Ketelaere, Lookman, etc., Scamacca last year. These players had struggled in previous years. They go to Gasperini's system. Same with Duvan Zapata, Luis Muriel in the past as well. And Gasperini is arguably the best manager in Europe, at least the most underrated in getting attacking returns out of players that have previously struggled. And Højlund had looked okay at Atalanta. It was clearly a massive overpay at the time. And after a promising first year, he's really struggled this year with, and it has to be said, like a really rotating cast of players around him and kind of a lack of creativity as well. You know, even United's most promising forwards at the start of this season, whether it's Garnacho or Rashford, they feel more like shoot-first forwards than necessarily big creators. Bruno Fernandes, the only real natural elite creator in this Man United side, and he had a really poor start to the season, but has been brilliant in the last few months. But Ekitike, in a different way to Højlund, I think has better build-up play. He can dribble more effectively than Højlund, and he can run the channels just as effectively as Højlund. And there are some concerns that, because he's got that kind of Alexander Isak build, which is why I imagine Newcastle ended up going for Alexander Isak in that summer. They do profile very similarly in terms of their physical capabilities, but he's stronger than people think as well. He's reasonably good in the air. He's pretty two-footed, and he has experience at a big club in PSG, where yes, he wasn't the big name signing that summer, but he's been through the situation where you're the club that attracts the most headlines in France. And Man United, for all their struggles, still generate the most headlines in England and are the biggest club in England by history, at least. So I think Ekitike has a good CV in order to hit the ground running at Man United. And also there's an element of Man United having to be slightly realistic about signings. You know, Gyökeres would be a dream, I think, given his work under Amorim before. That's a hit the ground running signing. But does he want to go to a Man United that might be, if they don't win the Europa League, and they've still got to play a Lyon side that has some really talented players, Athletic Club or Rangers, but probably Athletic Club in the semi-final before they even get to the final? That looks like a tall task for a Man United side that are still really inconsistent. So it feels like they will be out of European competition next year. Does Gyökeres or Victor Osimhen wait? In particular, in Victor Osimhen's case, do they quote unquote waste another year at Old Trafford and wait for Man United to be back in Europe, given the fact he's at his peak? Probably not. So someone like Hugo Ekitike feels like a good investment. And it is another sign, along with Man United looking at some EFL top talent like Joe Bellingham, like Chris Rigg, that Man United are being more realistic about where they are and who they need to sign in order to return to the top.
Yeah, and it has displeased many when they see news that United are not going to be chasing that household name. It is really setting the foundation and the benchmark for a philosophy that's looking towards building towards a unified vision of a collective group of talented youngsters. Some people buy into it and some people don't. It's funny you've mentioned Victor over in Sporting, because I see Duncan Castles came out yesterday and referenced that the player doesn't have any interest in moving to Manchester United, that he wants to move to a club where he can prove himself on the continental scene and win trophies. And I know for me, I think if you're a striker entering your prime, what would be the better carrot than leading this Manchester United frontline back to the head of the table for perennial competition at the highest level? I mean, that to me just sells itself. But unfortunately, I'm not a professional footballer. Now, briefly, ahead of Tuesday's trip to Forest, as we said, United are unbeaten in 4, and there is a growing sense of familiarity and confidence building within the group. Furthermore, even though Amorim has not yet managed to get domestic back-to-back wins, there is back-to-back wins in all competitions with 7 goals scored. It brought the Reds into an international break on somewhat of a high for a change, because it's usually misery that we enter international breaks with. Amorim's side make the trip to a Forest side who are exceeding all expectations and trilling my good buddy Jamie Jackson along the way, sitting third and also unbeaten in 4 themselves. Look, there's nothing guaranteed in football, particularly in the Premier League. But when you see the likes of Harry Maguire, Luke Shaw and Lenny Yoro returning to first team training, alongside the presence of Mason Mount, as you've said, in the matchday squad against Leicester, and Bruno Fernandes continuing to make many people eat their words in their criticism, how do you see this United side faring ahead of this difficult task on Tuesday?
I think it's interesting that you bring up the defenders, actually, because the defence does feel like the best stocked area of Man United going forward, and that's with Lindelof and Evans likely to leave this summer, given the fact that Yoro, Heaven, they're so promising. And I actually think Matthias de Ligt has looked really, really good in the last 4 or 5 weeks and deserves to have a shout out, because he has taken some flack during his time at Man United so far. I echo your thoughts about Forest. An unbelievable season. And it should give confidence to Man United that you can be, and I'm not even, it sounds like I'm taking the mickey out of Man United, but effectively fighting relegation one year, and with a few smart additions, a coach that effectively gets his message off really, really cleanly and effectively, you can climb the table rapidly. And Nuno, I think, has used what was a chaotic situation at Forest with so many players signed since they promoted. And he's effectively pulled out the 15, 16 players that he wants to use. And they've really benefited from a consistent lineup. The good news for Man United on Tuesday is that Chris Wood has picked up an injury whilst on international duty. He has been one of the stories of the season. What an amazing goal-scoring campaign for a guy that was struggling at Newcastle a few years ago. Since Nuno's arrival, he's been absolutely sensational. But there are a number of players that you need to be incredibly aware of. You know, Morgan Gibbs-White will be full of confidence after getting that much-deserved call-up to the England squad eventually. Callum Hudson-Odoi has been talking about how motivated he is after impressing under Thomas Tuchel during his time at Chelsea. There are threats throughout that side, and the curse of the former player could well be there with Anthony Elanga as well. And you look at the way that Rasmus Højlund's form and confidence has slowly looked like it's slightly coming back. He's now got a real tough test against Milenkovic and Murillo, who are, I think, being the outstanding duo, at least the most underrated duo, one of the most underrated duos in Europe, I think, this season, to be honest. Milenkovic, such a bargain buy, amazing in the air, so composed. And then Murillo, just this absolute wild card centre-half, throwing his body in the way of balls, trying to score from the halfway line. Just a complete... He really reminds me of Rudiger. It feels like slightly unhinged, but I absolutely love watching it. And Ola Aina's had a really good year at right back as well. Nico Williams has taken a big step forward, and Matt Sells has been brilliant in goal after years of messing around with their goalkeepers. So Man United, I think it's fair to say, go into that game as underdogs, but this momentum has to be capitalised on, particularly the Real Sociedad game. Yes, Real Sociedad have been a bit of a mess this year. You're right to point out they lost some key players like Mikel Merino and Le Normand, and Alguacil's treatment of Kubo is a bit confusing as well. But Real Sociedad have had better success than Man United in recent years in terms of their own league position and in terms of their performances in Europe. So to knock them out pretty comprehensively with Dorgu playing a crucial role and De Ligt looking like he's getting to really top levels again, I thought that was really promising. So bring on Tuesday from a Man United perspective. You can go with a fair amount of confidence, I think.
That's about as fitting a way to end this conversation as we possibly could. Dougie, a pleasure chatting. What have you got coming up over the next coming weeks, and how can people get in touch with you if they fancy a chat, sir?
Yes, well, follow me on my social channels. It's just my name, Dougie Critchley. You can check out the podcast, The Truth, which is part of the Ranks FC podcast family. That's on Spotify and Apple. But yeah, always happy to help out any young journalist that wants any tips about how to break into the industry, as it were. I'm not saying I'm the finished article by any means, but always happy to help anyone that might want some help. And yeah, check out my socials. But yeah, thanks, Shaun, for having me on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Likewise, and even with your last words there and offering help towards the listeners, you're a gentleman, and people need to realise that. And that was one of the biggest parts that I wanted to get this conversation with you, because, as I said, it's so difficult to get across a very extensive point in a very limited manner. So I hope individuals can listen to this and listen to the nature of the guy that you truly are, and I very much enjoyed it. If you are still here listening, kindly follow us at theatre_of_red on every social platform. Subscribe wherever you're listening to be updated as soon as the latest episode lands. If you happen to be listening on Spotify, can you take 2 seconds to leave us a 5-star review? As I say every week, each one is very much appreciated. We will be back next week to digest the midweek outing in Nottingham as we prepare for the latest installation of the Manchester Derby. Have a great weekend, and thanks for tuning in.